Let's get going. Welcome everybody to this latest UK and Changing Europe webinar. Today we're looking at a report we've just released. And no, it's not Sue Gray's report. It is the infinitely more interesting UK and Changing Europe compilation, reviewing how the government is making use of its new post-Brexit freedoms. Where are we already diverging? Where are there gleams in the eyes about the possibilities of future divergence? And is that going to win lots of votes, or is it actually just going to impose a bunch more burdens on business? We've timed this to coincide with the second anniversary of the UK formally leaving the EU 13 months after the end of the Brexit transition. The government too is publishing its ideas. We've had a statement from the Prime Minister and the Attorney General about how they're proposing to take this big Brexit opportunities agenda forward. So where are we after all that? Well, that's what we're going to be discussing for the next hour and a quarter. I'm Joël Rutter. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at UK and Changing Europe, and I am joined by an absolutely tip-topo panel. So joining me are report editor, heavy lifter, man who did all the work, Anand Menon's front person on this, our researcher Joël Reland. Then we're joined by two of our most distinguished senior fellows at UK and Changing Europe, Professor Jonathan Portes from King's College London and Professor Sarah Hall from the University of Nottingham. And then two external commentators to give us a much wider view than focusing down on those sort of narrow, rather nerdy subjects. So ask whether this really is the agenda that's going to carry the Prime Minister forward to his, would it be fifth Conservative term? Joined by Robert Colvile, who wrote the hugely successful manifesto for the 2019 election, along with one or two others, I'm sure he would say, and comments regularly in the Sunday Times, and I think is director of the Centre for Policy Studies. And last but by no means least, Matthew Holehouse. Matthew is the British politics editor of The Economist. We want you to join in. This is an opportunity for you to post all your questions. So please join us on Slido, post questions there. But I'm anticipating quite a lot of questions, not least because there are already a lot of questions and we haven't even started. So if someone has asked, albeit much less well than you would have done, a question that's broadly similar to the one you would ask, please upvote it so it moves to the top of my screen, and I will therefore reflect popular preferences in what we ask. So please get upvoting. But of course, if nobody's asked your particularly intelligent question, then do post it as well. So that's what we're going to do. Getting going for an hour and 15 minutes. And let's just hope that Sue Gray's report isn't published while we're on air, so we can focus entirely on a much bigger issue than party time or not in Downing Street. So some of you will have already read and digested the report, but a few of you may not have done. So I'm going to kick off with my colleague, Joël Reland. Joël, what for you are the headlines from this report that we put out today?
Thanks, Joel. I think kind of the most notable thing when you kind of read our report kind of in the large is, despite the fact there's been quite a lot of recent criticism of the government for not making the most of Brexit, for not seizing the opportunities which come with taking back control of lawmaking, that actually quite a lot is going on. There really are a lot of plans kind of in development across Whitehall. The problem is they're often at the early stages and often seem somewhat contradictory. There's perhaps a lack of a unifying idea. If we want to think about what's going on in terms of divergence, I think it's helpful to look in terms of three different categories. The first are changes which happened as a result of the TCA, which was agreed with the EU. It's easy to forget sometimes that our immigration and trading systems changed overnight. A year ago, there's no longer free movement from the EU, and there are new non-tariff barriers to trade with the EU. And there are kind of, as it shows in the report, quite clear consequences of that already in terms of imports and exports, with the EU down more significantly than the rest of the world. It's not just a pandemic effect. And also EU migration, again, there are lots of job shortages, but they seem especially acute in areas particularly reliant on EU labour. So there are some practical examples of things having changed. And other areas as well where the government is getting underway. There's a subsidy bill to try and simplify the state aid regime, get money into industries to kind of, pursue Boris Johnson's levelling up agenda. And there's also reforms to the common agricultural policy, rewarding farmers more for, environmental aims rather than simply using their land for production. There are a second set of areas where less happened as a result of the TCA. We transplanted EU law in, but we have the freedom to diverge if we so wish. In this set of areas, less is going on at the moment. Plans appear in the earlier stages with a couple of exceptions, one being financial services, where the Treasury seems to be looking to liberalise rules quite a lot, not get close to the EU, but rather simplify EU rules, and also data privacy, the potential to get rid of some aspects of EU GDPR regulation, which could have consequences for trade with EU. As a result, there could be less market access. A third set of areas are emergent sectors, where there are potentially less cost divergence or fewer costs because there is less EU legislation to move away from. We're talking about AI, we're talking about potentially gene editing, we're talking about lots of digital kind of, emerging points, also financial technology, this kind of stuff. And again here, plans feel in their early stages. There's not a clear direction of travel at the moment. We're kind of just getting underway with discussions. So kind of the point to take away is divergence is still in the early stages. I think it's premature to ask what happened to Brexit, say that it's all over. Plans take a while to emerge. And that's something that I hope we can discuss throughout today.
Brilliant. Okay, well, that sets us up very nicely. So, Jonathan, you concentrate on migration policy. You know a lot about that, worked in government on that, as well as at King's College London. This is, for many people, the big prize of Brexit was the ending of free movement and UK taking back control of its borders. So what does that look like? Have we really done that? And what are we doing with that newfound power?
The short version is yes, we have. And this is probably the biggest single area of divergence or change post-Brexit, in my view. Once the UK had decided that it was going to end free movement and leave the single market, that meant that we had to have a new immigration regime, in the sense, that choice, which was made pretty soon after the Brexit vote, and certainly by the time of Theresa May's party conference speech in late 2016, meant that we needed a new immigration system. And this is one area where essentially we have got what we were promised. That is to say, Vote Leave promised us a migration system which treated everybody pretty much the same, regardless of where in the world they came from. And that is, with the exception of Ireland, that is pretty much what we have got. We have got a regime that means that if you are moving to the UK to work, or indeed to join your spouse or partner, then the rules that you have to follow are the same whether you're coming from France, or Brazil, or Canada, or Pakistan. So we've got what we, but of course, that didn't say anything about what the rules are. So what are those rules? And the interesting thing here is that Theresa May, and perhaps some of those who supported Brexit, wanted a system that would lead to a substantial reduction in net migration. That is to say, they wanted to level down. They wanted essentially to apply the same rules to Europeans that we applied to non-Europeans, which at that time, because Theresa May had been Home Secretary for so long before being Prime Minister, and because she was trying to hit David Cameron's net migration target, were pretty restrictive. They included a quota on the number of skilled workers who could come here, and some quite restrictive rules and thresholds as to who could come here. The system we've got now does not represent that leveling down. It's much more a sort of meet in the middle. It's a system which is considerably less restrictive than the one that previously existed for non-Europeans, although considerably more restrictive than free movement, obviously. So we have a system that has a salary threshold. Basically, you can come here if you have a job offer that pays more than about £25,000 a year. And that job is in an occupation with that requires skills basically at the level of 2A levels and above or so. And that is a pretty liberal system by international standards. It means that, according to my calculations, which the Home Office has sort of informally confirmed, that approximately half of all jobs in the UK are in principle open to people from outside the country. In other words, 1 of every 2 jobs that are currently where there is an employer, the employer could in principle offer that to a non-Brit, and that person could secure a visa on the basis of that job offer to come here. There's also been reduction. The quota has been abolished. There's been the resident labour market test, which meant that you had to show in principle that you couldn't get a Brit to do the job. That's been abolished. And there's also a special health and care visa that means for people coming to work in the NHS, the restrictions are even less, there are even fewer restrictions. So this is, by international standards, a pretty liberal system. And for non-Europeans, it's a more liberal system, I would say, than probably any European country applies. So in this sense, we've made a pretty big change. It's not a change which necessarily means that we'll have more net migration. We'll probably have slightly lower net migration because of the end of free movement, but it's equally not one that will lead to a radical reduction in migration. And indeed, the first results of the new system have, somewhat to my surprise, I have to say, because I didn't think the Home Office would be able to get it up and running so quickly, but they have. Those of us who doubted them on that have to put their hands up and say we were wrong. Credit there. The first results of this new system show that actually visas have gone up quite significantly. We've seen a very substantial increase in the number of student visas issued, also liberalized, and a lot of people coming in under the new healthcare route. And that's all, so even before the end of the pandemic, we're seeing some significant uptake in immigration from outside the EU. Sorry.
I was going to say, and that's despite the fact that it's quite a high cost migration regime.
It is a high cost migration regime, and it's particularly so if you want to stay here for a long time or if you want to bring your family and so on. But even despite that, we are seeing increases in the number of people coming here on dependent visas as well as on main visas. So the cost, while it obviously is an obstacle for some people, overall does not seem to be as much of a barrier as you might have feared. So what's the net economic impact of this? Well, I think the first thing I'll say is that those of us who warned of the substantial negative net economic impacts of leaving free movement, have had our worries considerably assuaged, I think. Compared to the sort of system Theresa May would have introduced, this system seems to me to be, if I had to guess, might be neutral overall rather than negative. It is a considerable improvement on where we could have been. Does that mean we will have significant economic gains? I don't know. It is a much more managed system in the sense that it requires a lot. There is more Whitehall environment, there's more bureaucracy, more visas, more central planning from Whitehall and Westminster, as it were. So talking about this as a sort of a move to a much more liberal in the economic sense regime, I think is not quite right. But in terms of the long-term economic impacts, I think we can be considerably less worried than we would have been 2 or 3 years ago. So I'll stop there for the moment.
Okay, that's really interesting. That's an area where the UK is imposing its new policy preference, but they might not be quite what some people expected. We'll come on to that in a second. But Sarah, in our report, we note financial services, an area where we could have stayed aligned. We spent much of last year and waiting for an equivalence decision, puts the time we've been waiting for Sue Gray's report into the shade. We never got it. So is the UK now striking out on its own on financial services? And what have we learned so far about where they're going?
Yeah, so I very much agree with you and Joël that financial services does appear to be one of the economic sectors that's attracting significant attention in Whitehall in terms of the prospects for divergence. We saw this quite clearly in Rishi Sunak's agenda for post-Brexit financial services in his Mansion House speech. We saw it in the TIGA report, which was identifying regulatory opportunities post-Brexit. And then in the comments from the Prime Minister just today, he argues that he's looking for an ambitious approach to financial services post-Brexit. So to get to that position where the UK is emphasising the regulatory opportunities from Brexit, financial services has actually come quite a long way over the process of the Brexit period. So the UK is a financial services powerhouse. It was before Brexit and it still currently is. And early on in the Brexit process, I think the sector had some expectations that almost regardless of what form of Brexit took in other policy domains, there might be the prospect of some sort of special carve out for financial services, whereby it maintained a degree of market access to the EU. As Brexit proceeded in the 2010s, it became increasingly clear that that special treatment of financial services wouldn't be available. Without free movement, there would be no special market access for UK financial services. That's really significant because in 2019, figures show that the EU accounted for around 40% of UK financial services exports. And they were on the back of something called passporting, which essentially allowed firms in the UK to service EU clients from their UK base. I think it's important to note that the UK didn't trade exclusively with the EU in financial services. There's a long history of London as an international financial centre. And perhaps the period of EU membership is best seen as a period of tightening integration between the UK and the EU on top of those international trading relationships. But it is clear, I think, that Brexit marks a break in terms of that period of tight integration between the UK and the EU. So without passporting, the UK became reliant on what are called equivalence decisions, and that allows financial services trade in specific areas where the EU designates that the UK is equivalent to the EU in regulatory terms. I think one of the big surprises, and again, this sort of narrative of how far financial services has come over the Brexit period, is around the TCA. I think when the TCA was agreed, there was a sense that that might unlock additional equivalence decisions, that it might foster a relationship of trust between the UK and the EU, which would support additional market access for the UK. And that categorically hasn't happened. So the UK has was given two equivalence decisions. One has now expired, so it has one, which is considerably fewer than what we would see as competitor financial centres like New York or Singapore. The UK has taken a very different approach to equivalence of the EU compared to the EU itself. So the UK has a much more liberal approach to equivalence for EU-based financial services. The UK's system emphasises kind of negotiation, trust, and tries to point towards longevity. The EU's approach to equivalence emphasises its temporal nature, so these decisions could be revoked within 30 days' notice. So currently the UK is operating with markedly less market access formally than other competitor financial centres. What happens next, I think, is really interesting. Faced with that radically decreased market access, the UK has turned to look at what regulatory divergence it might be able to develop. And we've seen, and there are a really significant number of reviews going on concerning the UK's financial services rulebook. Some of these try to learn lessons from other regulatory approaches. So we could think about the Hill Listings Review, which tried to think about how tech firms listed in the US and whether the UK could be made attractive in that sense. Some of them focus on particular parts of financial services that the UK is seeking to develop. And I think we might come on to this, but here, green finance and fintech would be two areas that the UK is prioritising. I think it's important to note that trade deals in and of themselves are probably less important for financial services than some other sectors of the economy, and that's common for the service sector. But some bilateral agreements could be very important, so potential recognition between the UK and Switzerland, for example. So the UK, I think it is true to say, has identified a number of areas where it's seeking to diverge. I think what's critical, though, is that the more the UK diverges, the less likely positive equivalence decisions from the EU would likely to be. So I think it's important to think about the opportunities, but also which doors might shut by going down that route.
Okay, that's really interesting. So those are two areas where the UK really is sort of, doing things differently as a result of Brexit. Robert, I want to come to you next. Is that what you think the Brexit coalition that propelled the Boris Johnson government to power 2 years ago were looking for? Or what is there much more to be done? We've seen the Prime Minister, talking up some of the sort of rather minor changes, like using pounds and ounces, this crown stamps things on beer glasses. What actually gets the juice of sort of Brexit supporters going? Is it the chance to have our own green taxonomy, or to rebalance migration, or what are they really looking for in this agenda?
Sure. Apologies for being slightly twitchy on the screen. This event is a wonk's nightmare because while we've been talking, the government has published the full 100-page document listing its deregulatory agenda since Brexit, fleshing out the statement and press release we got today. So I'm trying very hard to resist just sort of putting you on mute and diving into the details.
Don't put us on mute. Well, yeah.
The answer is obviously that there was never one Brexit, and never one Brexit cause. Arguably the most committed Brexiteer in British politics is John McDonnell, who published, earlier than pretty much any senior Tory, published a paper which I could never get anyone interested in, arguing that we needed to leave the EU because it was a capitalist conspiracy preventing the creation of a left-wing utopia. And privately Labour left people will say that Jeremy Corbyn would sort of come up to them and whisper "good luck" during the referendum campaign. So like there is the idea that the idea that Brexit and sort of Singapore on Thames are co-equal is not true. Not least the campaign for the Brexit campaign itself was one which was it wasn't 350 million quid a week to cut your taxes. It was 350 million quid a week for the NHS. Even Boris Johnson, there's a very strange thing when he stands for Tory leader. He's standing there promising to be Michael Heseltine. He's listing his campaign promises, which are, I will hire more public servants and I will spend more money on infrastructure. And the most rabid right-wingers in the Tory party are cheering from the rafters because he is also promising to do Brexit. And then there is the things you can do with Brexit are not. There is a wide range of, as everyone's pointed out so far. There's a wide range of things you can do with Brexit. And in fact, some of the ways they are using their freedoms are explicitly not ways that free market Singapore and Thames types would like. So I, for example, am pretty like the state aid rules of the EU. I think are a pretty good way of stopping countries distorting their markets. And I think it's slightly weird that we are making use of our post-Brexit freedoms to enable government to pick more winners, which I personally don't think is a good idea, but it's what the it's a popular idea, and it's what the government wants to do. That said, I think there is a tension within the Conservative Party. You saw it within the Brexit movement. You saw it with Lord Frost's resignation. I wrote about it in my Sunday Times column a few weeks ago. That there is a general feeling that that things haven't gone far enough, fast enough. That the point of clean Brexit, hard Brexit, that we went for the type of Brexit which maximised our opportunities to diverge rather than maximising opportunity rather than minimising damage. That was the switch from May to Johnson. But but as yet there haven't been as many the divergence has not been as clear as except on, for example, immigration. The divergence has not been as clear as many expected, and I think part of that is about the nature of the government. The more interventionist, more kind of actually more sort of Christian Democrat kind of version of conservatism that Boris Johnson likes. And part of it is about the fact that government moves extremely slowly. I mean, you're referring to financial services. it's going to be quite a few years since between Rishi Sunak making that speech and then and the changes actually coming in. Likewise, there are other areas where for now we are going along with the EU's rules. GDPR would be a classic one where government really does want to do something different, but like working out what that different thing is takes time. There's also the fact that there is a tension here between the status quo and the future. The chemicals directives is a pretty good one. Under the EU we were part of REACH. Quite a lot of people said this is extraordinarily cumbersome, bureaucratic. Other countries have much better approaches to this. Can't we copy them when we come out? And they but when they go to the chemicals industry, and this kind of applies to other industries, they say no. We spent a load of money working out how to use these current rules. We don't want new rules coming in. So there's a tension between existing companies there and the innovation and dynamism you might create by opening things up versus the costs of having to follow two regulatory systems at once. So I think there's a sort of growing sense in government that the opportunities are sort of down the line. It's the focus on the future. Things like gene editing, AI, machine learning, whatever. It's essentially the if your central diagnosis of the EU completely accurately, in my view, is that it is an immensely cumbersome, bureaucratic, risk-averse organization which takes years to make any decisions and then probably makes the wrong ones. The idea that you can move faster on things as they come up, like blockchain would be another one. That's a pretty attractive idea. The issue there is that you still have the same civil servants and the same regulators making the decisions. So I think one of the interesting things you're seeing is the regulatory debate is becoming a debate within Britain as opposed to a debate between Britain and Europe. There's quite a lot of talk in government, and I've written about this before, and I suspect once I start Googling searching, it'll be in this new white paper about like pushing regulators to take more account of growth and innovation as objectives. Our British regulators are kind of, there was this phenomenon of gold plating EU regulation that we were very, very, even we sort of took it very seriously and made absolutely risk averse in a way that some other countries weren't. So I think there's a lot of things which are live here, and I don't think we can, although some do, I don't think we can at all make the judgment that we haven't, that like it's basically way too early to make any judgments. But it's certainly clear that the political space within the UK was never there for a with one bound we were free kind of approach to this. But that said, there is still space, I think, to do a lot more than they're currently doing, and I hope they will carry on in that direction.
Matthew, Robert's talked about the political space that Brexit and the type of Brexit that we saw in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement with minimal alignment has opened up. Is that a space the public is really, having voted for Brexit 52-48, is that a space that the public is very keen to see the government move into? Is there a sort of big public appetite for all these Brexit dividends?
Yeah, so my take on sort of public opinion is that it is a real constraint on how radical you can be. If you're talking about changing your whole sort of social and economic model off the back of Brexit, as some Brexit is, not all, as Rob points out, but a section of the Conservative Party imagined public opinion is a hindrance on that. I don't think it's the absolute prohibition on innovation and reform that is sometimes cast as, and I don't actually think it's the most sort of important constraint either. I think the most important constraint is probably more one of political failure rather than anything that public opinion does. The way I sort of think of this sometimes is that Johnson's idea of Brexit in 2016 was sometimes described as cakeist, in that there was this back in 2016, a lot of the thinking in the language was very, very cloudy and muddy, but there was this idea that you would have really, really deep market access and have the ability to diverge at the same time. So it was having your cake and eating it. As Lord Frost kind of characterises it, we're now in this position not of being cakeist, but anti-cakeist, and that Britain has surrendered quite a lot of market access and paid a very, very high very, very high economic price to do that, but actually isn't doing a huge amounts of radical divergence to compensate for that. So really, it is looking like the worst of both worlds. Now, what role does public opinion play in that? The starting point you might take actually is the speech that Theresa May did, Mansion House, in 2018, because she could see this trajectory of Britain surrendering a lot of market access and not actually doing a lot with it. And in the speech, she's talking to the EU, but she's also trying to confront her own benches. And in it, she says that even if you did embark on this relationship that cast Britain into the mid-Atlantic, you wouldn't be able to do a lot with it, because she said, the UK could not engage in a race to the bottom on standards and protections because there is no serious political constituency in the UK that would support this. Quite the opposite. Now, that line is actually kind of borne out in a lot of the polling. And position of anti-cake is kind of where the British public are, in that they voted to leave the EU, but they're also quite averse to doing a lot of the really radical things that might start to compensate for that. John Curtis has done a lot of work on this, as is the IPPR. We know, for example, that the British public were really keen on the EU's ban on mobile phone roaming charges. We know that British people really like EU's consumer protection laws. We know famously that the British public is averse to moving the SPS regime, the food standards regime, to something closer to that found in America, with all the sorts of production processes that they have in the meat industry there. We know that the British public is keen on the current labour laws. Things like getting rid of the Working Time Directive polls very badly. And you see this manifest itself from time to time, sometimes in a way that is justified and well-informed, sometimes a way that a little bit off-beam, in the social media campaigns that MPs are on the receiving end of, whether that's on sewage, on animal sentience, on Working Time Directive. We remember that quite early on in the Johnson government base floated the idea of revising EU labour laws. There was a huge backlash. The idea was quietly parked. We know that the Labour Party exploited concern around the US Free Trade Agreement in 2019 to great effect. So broadly, British public opinion is in a place of wanting to be Europeans without the EU. They want to be out of the European Union, but stick to much of the regulatory framework that it offers for non-benefits of social market access. That's quite a bad combination, really. It is sort of accepting many of the obligations of EU membership with few of the benefits. However, I wouldn't overplay this, the importance of public opinion. One is that actually the feed through is kind of imperfect. Would one actually lose an election if you did revise the Working Time Directive or the way in which chicken is prepared? I'm not convinced you would. I guess the defeat of Jeremy Corbyn would be a factor on that. The bigger thing is actually that when we think about regulatory policy, it doesn't actually lend itself to these sorts of civilizational binaries. When you're talking about things like reforming the aircraft slots regulation that governs how which airlines gets which landing slots at which airport, EU merge directive or the reform of procurement laws, these aren't things that actually lend themselves to easy combative campaigns, because it's small bore, it's nuanced, it shouldn't and doesn't excite political passions. I think the bigger constraint on why have we ended up in this position is actually that a lot of sort of the elite public debate around it, the elite opinion debate around it, is captured in 2016, in that you have one faction which wildly overstates the opportunities of re-regulation, this idea of a second Thatcherism. You have another side which paints a slightly sort of dystopian vision of what re-regulation might mean, or that believes that the idea of the opportunities of Brexit is an oxymoron and there's nothing more to it than changing the crown on the pint glass. Actually, the space is sort of both bigger and smaller than each side would claim, but it is iterative, small bore work which will take many years, arguing over quite sort of technical changes that over a period might add up to something worthwhile. You don't see either you don't see either public opinion or really sort of opinion in the House of Commons cohering around that space. So it is it is unfortunately almost frozen into the spirit of 2016, 2017 in a lot of this.
So Matthew, I'm going to come to questions. I'm going to come first to you because I think you're best placed, I'm not going to say well placed necessarily, to answer this. And then any other panelists who want to come in. Top ranked question from Andy Day with a bit of an extra one from Peter May is about what Labour might do. We've talked a bit about this, being not quite the space that either side really would paint it. But Andy's asking, given Labour have said they won't re-enter the customs union or single market, what are the most effective realignments they could propose to ease trade? I assume that's this agenda of making Brexit work, the new 3-word slogan that they've done. And Peter May is suggesting they might start by re-entering Erasmus. Do you see, I'm going to then come on to Robert for whether the Conservatives should be worried about Labour making an issue of making Brexit work, but where do you think making Brexit work actually might potentially have most political purchase or indeed most economic purchase?
I'm conscious I might be wrong, so I wouldn't want to say categorically. I think the Labour Party has, I should know this, the Labour Party has said it would seek an agreement on SPS, on food and farm standards, essentially, which would make trade, particularly across the Irish Sea, but also with the European Union generally, easier. It would seek to look at things like the mutual recognition of professional qualifications, so the ease with which an auditor can work at KPMG in Germany. Politically, it's an interesting space, actually, because it does raise the question of whether, in the same way that Johnson held together a Leave coalition whilst the Remain coalition fragmented in 2019, if Starmer can do the opposite of that and hold together a Remain coalition, insofar as Leave Remain is still salient questions in 2019, and then start to actually eat into the Leave vote because the salience of Brexit has decayed in 2023, 2024. That's actually quite an interesting sort of political proposition. I think Starmer's bet is that he doesn't actually need to move that far on Brexit. In that, there are relatively few votes. His bet is that in 2023, 2024, there are relatively few votes in saying that one would rejoin the European Union. That the whole sort of second referendum campaign can be parked. I suspect that will probably pay off.
Robert, where are the Conservatives seeing this? With sort of Labour starting to talk a bit about Brexit again, this idea that they could iron out some of these sort of annoyances that nobody voted, particularly not to have an alignment on SBS or whatever, yet it's causing quite a lot of pain for seafood exporters or in the Irish Sea. Are you worried about this as a line? Is there actually anything behind this view that some Conservatives think we need to diverge a long way and quickly to prevent the sort of Brexit that David Frost negotiated being undone and watered down?
I think it's a really interesting straw in the wind of what's happened in British politics in the last couple of months that this question has been asked. This is genuinely the first time anyone has seriously raised the issue of what the Labour think as a kind of like a major factor in British politics for quite a while. I think it's a good point. I think especially about the need to sort of diverge further in case Labour get back in. I think the Tories still haven't. I'd say the Tories still haven't processed that idea yet. The polls are there at the moment, but they've still got an 80-seat majority. The election's still a couple of years away. So the debate about the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, that's not being carried out with a kind of a view of oh no, if we don't do something nice, if we don't make nice with the EU, then we open up a flank to Labour. It's the argument as to whether you push hard on that or whether you try to reach an accommodation. That's much more about what it will mean for the Conservatives, what it will mean for business, what it will mean for Northern Ireland at the moment.
Conservatives worried about their relationship with business, Robert. Brexit does seem to have driven quite a wedge between the government and what we used to, as the party of business, as we always used to think the Conservatives saw themselves over this and over businesses' pleas for a deeper deal and degrees of alignment?
Yeah, I think it has done some damage, and I think one of the reasons the supply chain crisis wasn't picked up earlier because it sounded like the same companies or same business lobby groups making the same complaints as they did about Brexit itself. I mean, on Thursday, I will be sharing a stage with the Director General of the CBI under the headline, "Are we actually serious about growth?" That's probably that's sort of a sign of that the business community is not feeling entirely, or at least the bit of it that the CBI represents is not feeling entirely love bombed by the government. I think partly that's just about the pandemic, which sort of blasts all these things into smithereens. But there was a real small business, family business agenda that was in the manifesto, and it was going to be at the heart of business relations. That kind of just ran into the sand. I mean, the government's defence is that they spent £400 billion, bailing out all of these companies and paying the wages of all their staff, which is a fair point. But I think, come April, we get some quite whacking tax rises on corporation. The NIC's rise is a tax rise on business as well as customers, which is often forgotten. The corporation taxes are going up. They still haven't announced what's happening with the investment super deduction. CPS work with the tax foundation in the US has found we go basically overnight. We go to having one of the least competitive business tax rate regimes in the world. Or the developed world, once all these things happen. So there's clearly a lot of concern about that.
That's quite interesting, the extent to which the EU was worried about us diverging downwards on business taxation. We've actually gone in the opposite direction since we left. Jonathan, a question from Adam Isaacs. He's asked what prospects are there for any degree of honesty about the costs as well as the benefits of leaving the EU. Perhaps focusing a bit less on the honesty. There are any comments on that would be interesting in your role as a former senior civil servant. But if we look at the balance sheet of costs and benefits, the government today, in its brief statement, haven't read the 100 pages, was talking about £1 billion benefits from reducing red tape. But against that, on the other side of the ledger, some might say that Brexit has actually dumped quite a lot of red tape on businesses that were in the business of exporting to the EU or employing EU labour. So where do we think the balance sheet stands at the moment?
Well, I was quite amused by the 1 billion figure because, of course, here Vote Leave talked about £33 billion of Brexit red tape, which was potentially going to be removed. That was in the leaflet they sent to everybody, and it was based on a particularly badly argued Open Europe pamphlet paper from 2015 or so, which added up all the notional costs of European regulation without bothering to assess the benefits of European regulation, and which got most of the numbers wrong anyway, as I recall. So we had these sort of fantasy numbers for the benefits of deregulation. I mean, my prior has always been that the net economic benefits, there may be other benefits and costs from relaxing standards or whatever, or indeed increasing standards in various areas. The best estimate that economists could make of the net cost and benefits of the deregulation agenda post-Brexit would be zero, because there would be relatively small costs offset by relatively small benefits. That could still be wrong. There could be some big benefits or big costs out there, but I've seen no reason to change my view that yes, there might be $1 billion in benefits, but there's probably $1 billion in costs as well. There's the costs, as Robert said, of what will probably be a less economically efficient state aid regime post-Brexit, for example. So I think we're back to saying that the main costs and benefits will be, as you said, Jill, on the trade front. And there we know that the net impact is going to be a substantial net cost to the UK economy. And again, so far at least, we have no reason to believe that the estimates that economists produced pre-Brexit or pre the deal are hugely wrong. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but the idea that it's going to impose costs of perhaps 4 or 5% of GDP is over the long term is consistent with what we've seen so far. And that, And so I think we're still back. We're back there. Look, the main economic impact of Brexit is the impact of increased trade restrictions with the EU and the damage that will do to UK trade, both through and hence to the UK economy, both through reduced imports and route exports. And so far, at least, there's no evidence to suggest that other things, whether that's deregulation or trade with the rest of the world, are going to make more than a pretty marginal impact either way on that. So I think we're still there in terms of what we think the net cost of Brexit will be.
So if anyone else is keen to leap in on net costs, Joel, come in.
So I think the interesting and probably most kind of under-discussed thing when you talk about where the UK wants to be in terms of deregulation, moving away from Brussels regulation, is the irony that even getting rid of regulation, you know, having a lighter touch economy actually increases bureaucracy in the short term. And when we're looking at divergence, there often are short-term costs, even if there might be longer-term gains. To give one example, the UK is moving to its own UKCA manufacturing stamp, which is replacing the EU CE stamp. And just moving all these businesses over onto the new UK regime is taking years. The deadline's already been delayed by a year and another 6 months. And in some cases, they reckon, you know, up to 60 years could be the amount of time it would take to stamp every single product in certain sectors with the right mark. And this is all for the case of simply copying something we were doing in the EU into the UK. If you want to do something more radical in terms of regulating medical devices or something like that, you need to establish an architecture. You need businesses to understand what they need to do. You need them to go through the new UK regime to make their products compliant with the UK market, and you need to make international producers aware of that. And there's a whole host of practical difficulties which are associated with even theoretical liberalization of the regulatory architecture. So if you think about doing this across multiple sectors, it's going to take years before you see any kind of potential benefit from your lighter touch regime. It's probably a decade down the line. And it's very, very difficult for any government to, you know, have that much time and be willing to bear that much short-term pain for businesses saying, we can't keep up with what you're demanding us to do. This is costing us, you know, the big business says they estimate it would cost them £1 million a year if we lost our EU data adequacy agreement, which would be the consequence of moving away from GDPR regulations. So there are heavy, heavy short-term costs for potential long-term benefit. And yeah, when you look at someone like Boris Johnson in his current political situation, does he have the capital to pursue that pain? He certainly doesn't. Would Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss have the want to be suddenly pushing on with those regulatory reforms, the pain that comes with that when you've got an election 2 years down the line? I'm not sure they would. So that's the single biggest challenge I would say to ever trying to fundamentally remake the British economy.
That's very interesting. Well, let's look at an area where we can do things differently because of Brexit, which is trade policy. Sarah, Michelle Egan's asked, in terms of trade agreements, where are you seeing some innovations, or most of them roll over based on the standard EU template? Well, Michelle, most of them today are standard EU rollovers, but we have got one or two new ones. And we know that the UK has always thought that one of the features of independent trade policy would be to do much more for UK services, because that's the big UK interest and more than a giant sort of homogenized EU interest. So is there proof in the pudding that we can do more for UK services in, say, UK Australia or the slightly revised agreement with Japan? Sarah?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say about trade and services is that the issues are quite different than they are for goods. So it's not about customs controls and quotas. It's really a question of regulatory alignment or not alignment. And there's some good reasons for that. You know, you want to know that a doctor operating in your jurisdiction has the required regulatory certificates to practice safely. So I think we need to kind of almost take a step back and think, you know, what's the purpose here? So when we're looking at free trade agreements and services, we're looking really essentially at who can deliver what type of service where. And as Matthew said, one of the areas where the UK has lost market access with the EU is in relation to the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. So this was an ask for the UK. I think there was quite a lot of a sense at the time that the UK had some quite interesting asks and important asks here in the Brexit trade negotiations, but it didn't make it through into the TCA. So that means that a lawyer or an auditor qualified in the UK has many more restrictions in terms of what they can do in the EU. In terms of new trade deals, the impact overall of new trade deals that the UK has struck is showing a small, very small economic gain compared to potentially lost trade with the EU. And in services, there are some examples of some innovations in these new deals. So the UK-Australia deal, for example, does have some innovation around the mobility of young professionals, particularly lawyers. But I'm being quite cautious here, because on the one hand, that increases potential mobility for UK lawyers. On the other hand, research shows that trade remains deepest usually with your closest geographical partner. So even in an era of Zoom and digital working, it still remains the case that trade is usually deepest with your nearest partner. And for the UK, that would be the EU. Similarly, Japan has some interesting clauses in it in relation to data localization and where data needs to be stored. So I think if you're looking for innovation in trade deals, in services, I would be looking for what happens around digital trade, data, and the mobility of individuals who are providing those services. So far, I think there are some early signs of some innovations in that area from the UK. That shouldn't be surprising. The UK is a services powerhouse and stands to gain a lot if it can liberalise services trade. But the actual impacts of those so far, and what we might expect, at least in the short term, I think are quite minimal.
That's really interesting. Sarah, the question about UK Switzerland, I wondered very quickly, you might just say, are we about to see the emergence of a new UK Switzerland relationship, and what will that do to Switzerland's relationship with the EU?
So yeah, this really hinges quite significantly on professional services, so things like legal services, but also financial services. And it's not surprising there's been a lot of interest here. So now Switzerland and the UK are major service economies, internationally orientated service economies, so not particularly servicing their own domestic markets, but internationally open service economies sitting on the outside of the EU. So there's quite a lot of interesting parallels between the two economies. And on financial services, this is an area where there's been quite a lot of activity post-Brexit, with both sides committed to securing a mutual recognition of regulation and their supervisory regimes. That's quite significant, because if you have mutual recognition between the UK and Switzerland, it's taking place without the wider framework of the single market that the EU has to support a similar set of activities. So you would essentially be seeing a version of passporting, but without the requirement for freedom of movement that the EU has. And I think it's that kind of innovation in terms of trade regulation that is attracting some interest. I think as well, there was some evidence in the run-up to the agreement of the TCA that the EU was looking to be quite clear about how temporary equivalence regimes were with Switzerland. It's sounding something of a warning shot to the UK that even if you secure equivalence decisions under the EU's approach to equivalence, that can be revoked with 30 days notice. And there's quite a lot of noise around that in the run-up to the TCA. So I think for me, the interest there is that it would be quite innovative to have this kind of passporting and mutual recognition outside of freedom of movement. There clearly is some scope for enhanced trade there because of the similarities between the two economies. And I think that's why the EU would be watching that quite closely. It's quite the EU is in quite an unusual position as a trade bloc now, having its major financial centre offshore or outside its regulatory orbit. That's very different to the US, for example, where its major financial centre is clearly within its own regulatory control.
It's a very interesting sort of question. I'm not sure whether any of you are up for chatting about this, but we've got some questions about actually what does the loss of the UK mean to the way in which the EU develops regulation? Does it mean that the EU will go in a different direction? The UK was quite influential in the EU, dare we say it? Has anyone got any views on that? Robert?
Well, I mean, Matthew would be better placed on this, but and indeed Jonathan. But the I mean, one thing that's striking, I think, is that since the UK's departure, it has actually it didn't seem to provoke any soul searching in the EU. It was strange that the one of its largest members deciding to leave was sort of written off as, oh, those crazy Brits, rather than, oh dear, maybe we're doing something wrong. But it does feel like there has been a slight sort of course correction, not least because of the potential competitive pressures from the UK. So it's actually possible that the EU will get around to fixing the god awful mess that is Solvency II before the UK can come up with its own lighter touch version of that.
Matthew, do you think that the EU is likely to move in a sort of different direction to the counterfaction in which the UK had stayed and retained an influence there?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want to overstate it, because there's a risk of seeing things through Union Jack coloured glasses, and I wouldn't want to do that. However, so the UK contribution to sort of EU lawmaking was obviously large from the genesis of the single market, and it kind of fell into three forms. One was sort of suggesting and devising and helping to be the architect of whole regimes of themselves. State aid being one, the REACH regime for chemicals being the other. Obviously, it was within the balance of power within policy making. The UK was often a sort of the centre of a sort of a liberalising caucus, and actually, the UK just played quite a large role in making laws work better. So just the fine bore revising and thinking about the functioning of proposals from the Commission. Not necessarily about blocking things or changing the direction, but actually just helping the thing work well. The UK didn't play an unsubstantial role. So I think Rob's right that actually one of the interesting sort of dogs that has embarked on Brexit actually has been this discussion about what does it mean for EU policymaking. And one of the genuinely open questions is, in cases where the UK might have interesting ideas, particularly around new sectors, what impact that actually has on the EU, whether the UK, Lord Frost said this, and people sort of thought it was rather laughable. I don't think it is entirely laughable to say that actually, if the UK is an innovator, does that actually help inspire any thinking within the EU 27? I think that's. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's an open question, but I think it's I don't think it's something to be dismissed entirely.
So one of the things that I think is very interesting, Matthew, is this idea that the UK might lead in some of these sort of greenfield areas. I think Rob was saying that that's actually where there's more productive than looking at the backstock of EU regulation, whereas Joel said we've already sort of incurred the compliance costs of getting used to that regime. But what do you think the chance is if we develop an innovative approach to AI or autonomous vehicles or something I haven't even thought of yet, that we can sort of back transfer that into the EU? Because whatever happens, there's still a bigger market than the UK is, and the real gains will be if that sort of, that if we sort of reverse the line, the EU aligns with our innovative way, and we've stolen a march, and our manufacturers and service providers are all good to go and take over the EU market, she said. Is there any real prospect of a London effect displacing a Brussels effect?
I mean, I guess the way you might think about it is that often a lot of the way in which you regulate these new industries is actually it's about problem solving. It's something that UK regulators have often been quite good at, in that you have genuine open questions such as how do you insure for autonomous vehicles? Where does the burden of responsibility lie? How do you resolve an insurance dispute between two driverless cars? And actually, you just have to produce an answer and you have to solve it. And if the UK can be somewhere which is answering and solving, and it's big if, but if the UK is somewhere that can resolve those questions earlier, before the EU regime does, then that's something that makes the UK an attractive place to do business. And then it is an interesting and genuine open question whether you do see any sort of London effect by which those answers which are drawn up in London do become adopted elsewhere. I can't think of any examples where we have seen that so far, but I think it's it is one of the big sort of ones to watch with Brexit.
Joel, did any of our authors come up with an area where there might be a London effect?
None of them did, but I have one, if that's any good, which is, I think AI is a particularly interesting test case here. So the EU is making quite a big play in terms of it's come out with a set of new AI regulations. They're not enforced yet, but there's a plan to basically govern more strictly how you use AI. So rules around transparency. If you're using a chatbot when you're talking to your bank, you will be told if you are talking to a robot, that kind of thing, which makes the process less murky, less gloomy. And there are two ways of looking at the way this could go. The one theory is the Brussels effect theory, which is that because the EU is setting the regulations on AI, the UK will simply have to follow because it's got a much larger market on its doorstep, which it wants access to. To give a practical example, if you're developing a chatbot AI in the UK, even if you want to sell that technology to China, to a Chinese company so that they can produce a piece of technology, if they want to then sell that technology back into the EU market, they have to make sure that the AI which came from the UK initially was compliant with these new EU standards. So there's going to be a big pull effect on businesses to make sure all AI is compliant with the EU if they want to sell into that market, and the UK, a much smaller market by comparison. You might think, okay, and personally, I do think this is the most likely effect, is the UK will end up feeling somewhat obliged to follow EU regulatory standards. The other argument is that the UK will be that slightly more innovative testing ground just outside of the EU, where you can do things in a slightly more permissive way, be a bit more experimental with your AI, and then if you want to then sell that into the EU, you get rid of the small elements which might not be compliant with EU regulation. For example, if there's some facial recognition technology in there that's not going to cut it in the EU market, you chuck it and you sell in minus that. To me, that seems slightly aspirational and slightly utopian, but those are the two clashing theories. Generally, the Brussels effect has won out in things like data privacy so far. Maybe AI is some kind of uncharted territory where things are going to change, but I remain skeptical.
I don't think it's implausible to say that to argue, and certainly I would hope this would be the case, that our slightly more liberal approach to non-EU immigration will over time represent as a competitive advantage with respect to the EU, that they will in either at an EU level or at an individual country level, that they will feel some obligation to try and catch up with. If we are a more attractive place for people, skilled workers from abroad to move to, that is a competitive advantage, and something the EU, at least if they are thinking about this and properly, ought to try and because there are a number of EU countries which have pretty uncompetitive and illiberal migration regimes, quite frankly, for people coming outside the EU. There is some pressure there. To give a recent example where I think there is a discernible London effect, although it really reflects the extent to which, as Matthew said, we are just fundamentally a European country in terms of attitudes. I think if you look at the EU's recent draft directive on the regulation of gig economy workers, employment rights for gig economy workers, nobody has, nowhere does it say this, but it is very clear to me from reading it that it is very heavily influenced by the Supreme Court ruling about Uber. They use the Supreme Court here, set out a framework for deciding under what conditions gig economy workers, should be considered as employees rather than as self-employed. And the draft directive from the Commission actually, to a very large extent, takes their frame of analysis and recreates it at a European level. Now, that's not law yet. But it seems to me, to illustrate the extent to which there is this sort of common intellectual framework in terms of how we approach things like labour market regulation that is going to stay after Brexit, because we are just fundamentally, we do have quite similar social models, despite all the protestations to the contrary on both sides of the channel.
Sarah, financial services is a bit of a battleground while we were in the EU. You mentioned now that the EU would feel very uncomfortable that its major financial centre was effectively offshored. So is this an area where actually the fact of Brexit might drive a lot of divergence and different approaches in the EU, more of a sort of, French mentality shift, and basically excluding the UK to grab that as much of that financial centre back into the EU?
So yeah, I mean, in some parts of financial services, the EU has been very clear that essentially onshoring financial services from the UK to the EU, is its aim. So we've seen this very recently with respect to the one outstanding equivalence decision, which relates to clearing. Mairead McGuinness, the EU Commissioner for Financial Services, has indicated that this is due to expire in June this year, and it's now likely to be extended until June 2025. But at the same time, the EU is proposing to launch a consultation on measures aimed at making the EU an attractive clearing hub. So you see quite clearly there an aim to move financial services activity. I think there's a really interesting set of questions about what form and approach to financial services regulation the EU seeks to develop post-Brexit. I think it's very clear that the UK was a really important actor in the ways that Matthew's articulated more generally within financial services in the EU. I think there's another piece of the jigsaw, though, for financial services, which perhaps builds on some of Joel's comments, in that I think it's important to locate discussions about UK-EU trade and regulation within the international arena, particularly in financial services. So there's been some concern that kind of fragmentation between the UK and the EU might actually lead to financial services activity relocating to the US, for example, as businesses sort of seek to move there to overcome additional costs with dual reporting between the UK and the EU. And there's some evidence of that happening, at least early on in the Brexit deal, with relation to derivatives. But that international angle is also important in terms of regulation. And the UK may be able to shape EU regulation, not directly, but with the EU, but by seeking to position the UK's regulatory approach as the kind of global standard of regulation in that particular area, and then trying to encourage the EU to follow that global standard. And that's been quite a common leitmotif in the UK's approach to financial services more generally. So kind of shifting scales, if you like, seeking to set itself as the global leader and then encouraging competitors to follow that. And I think there's some evidence of that type of activity taking place in relation to green finance at the moment. It's a really important set of questions that the UK, the EU, but also other countries are grappling with about what counts as green when it comes to finance. It's a really important set of questions because the answer to it is meant to prevent greenwashing, so kind of passing an activity off as green when it isn't. But at the moment, there's multiple standards internationally about what counts as green, and that's costly for businesses. So there's something of a set of challenges for any country seeking to operate in green finance in terms of having its standards become the global standard with respect to green finance. I think it's in areas like that we need to remember that UK-EU regulatory dialogues are taking place within a global framework.
Okay, that's a very useful reminder. Robert, we've got a question here from Joe Marshall about Lord Frost's departure. I think Lord Frost made quite a stirring speech, I think, to the CPS, and then left not very long later. Maybe his resignation was already in the Prime Minister's in tray. But he was a very discernible champion of this sort of post-Brexit opportunities agenda and seemed to think he had a lot of work to do. But he's now disappeared, and the Prime Minister has given the negotiating responsibilities to Liz Truss, but sort of left the Brexit Opportunities Unit a bit orphaned in the cabinet. I mean, are you worried about that? Do we need a champion within government for all these opportunities post-Brexit, or is it now so, what in Whitehall we'd say mainstreamed, which often means forgotten?
So on Lord Frost, I genuinely think that he left, that he didn't just leave because of because of the Northern Ireland Protocol and the regulation and things. I think from everything he said, from everything those around him have said, I think the coronavirus restrictions, the sort of the general drift of government, he just wasn't comfortable. That said, I do. I wrote an entire column about this. So it's helpful of you to tee me up for it. I think without him there's definitely less of a push. And I think what happens to the Brexit Opportunities Unit is quite key. Unless you have quite a powerful central unit, a sort of grit in the oyster, pushing and nagging at the rest of the Whitehall with a powerful champion at the head of it, then inevitably this agenda gets downgraded. One sort of really interesting, essentially, and I think a lot. The conversation about this as being about Brexit regulation is, I think, missing the point. It's about how we regulate, full stop. And there's a really interesting, we've been doing a big project on this at the Centre for Policy Studies, which is hopefully coming out fairly soon. What happens in the UK is essentially ministers and civil servants make decisions and then write up the regulatory impact assessment once they've done that in order to justify the decisions they've already made. Whereas in the US, for example, what will happen is a federal office will say, we want to do this thing. They will put it into the OMB, the sort of very, very powerful central budgeting organization. And that will send basically has sort of packs of sort of ravenous wolves in the form of economists who will go over this thing and just basically throw it back at them and say, no, this is going to cost too much money. Your sums are wrong. We don't have any equivalent of that kind of function in the UK. We have people like the NAO who come along sort of 6 months, a year after the fact and go, oh, that was a bit of a crap decision you made back then. And I think one of the things they want to do with this Brexit, with the white paper that's just been put out, is to try and shift that. But you're working against an awful lot of inertia. I mean, there's a line. One of my colleagues has just texted me something pointing out that they say. We considered a 1 in 2 out target for regulation, but effectively what it says is, but then we realized we had net zero coming and that was impossible. So, there's a whole, I think this is going to be a live issue for quite a while, but even whether it's 1 billion or 33 billion, which is an excellent stat from Jonathan, like the post-Brexit bit of this is not the big slice of the cake. I think there's just a general thing about how we regulate now, and I think that's the key battleground for me.
Okay, well, we're 4 minutes away from the end, so just to bring you all in together, I'm going to just ask you all to give a view on what should we watch out for? Where's the really interesting divergence action going to be in the next 2 years until a general election? Let's forget all the sort of political frippery that we've been distracted by, but in terms of policy, what's going to be really, really interesting? So very brief answers so we can finish on time. Sarah, where's the interesting policy action in the next couple of years?
So for me, the really interesting question is, how much is the government prepared to talk about deregulation and regulatory divergence of the city? There's some quite obvious areas for divergence, particularly around bankers' bonuses, for example, that it's steered clear of, I think because of the politics of being seen to be supporting London and the South East in an era of levelling up. So for me, the big question is, to what extent does it push for city deregulation, and how does that fit with its wider regional economic policy?
Okay, Jonathan.
I do see GDPR as a sort of test case, although I don't pretend to understand it or to understand what the precise cost and benefits, but it seems to me that it's something big where potentially we could probably do a better job ourselves, but there are also clearly significant costs and risks to diverging because there is one area where there genuinely obviously is a Brussels effect. So are we going to bite the bullet and try and do that? And if so, does it work, or does it all end up as a terrible mess? So that, I think, is a really interesting one.
Matthew.
I'm going to say state aid, and for the reason that we think, I mean, obviously there is one of the most radical new bits of legislation is the state aid framework, which really has drawn up the Brussels rulebook. And the most important thing to remember is that state aid is not just about suitcases of cash to ailing companies, but increasingly in the European context, it's about tax breaks, and it is about what you use to stop governments giving enormous tax breaks to people like Apple, IKEA, Fiat, and all the others. So the UK government now has really a lot more flexibility to do things really radically different. And how it chooses to use it is going to be very, very interesting indeed.
Joel.
I'm going to say agriculture, which always gets people's pulses racing, I know. But for two reasons. Firstly, that what the UK is trying to do in terms of moving away from the common agricultural policy is a pretty radical reform. There was a very good case to be made that the system wasn't that well suited to UK farming, and moving away from a system that's rewarding effectively as much production as possible to a system where you're rewarded for pursuing net zero sustainability benefits is not only a radical departure, but it's also potentially a really good example of how the UK can get ahead in pursuing net zero as well, because they're kind of, coexisting objectives. And the second reason why it matters is because, and this is really an indictment of policy debate in general, is it's we haven't talked about different attitudes in different parts of the UK, and agriculture is a devolved policy. England is potentially doing something different to Wales or Scotland, and therefore you increase the risks of internal divergence, competition between farmers in different parts of the UK. That has all kinds of complications potentially coming from it, and that's an under-discussed aspect of divergence in general, is what it looks like if internally the UK starts to split apart.
Last word, Robert.
Yeah, and that's a really important point. And the other thing we haven't mentioned is the Northern Ireland Protocol, which is just the Northern Ireland situation, which is a huge issue. Like, if you want to diverge, you end up with a situation where one bit of the UK has a completely different regulatory model to the other. That's a huge issue. I think all of the examples given are great. Financial services is obviously a big one. The other thing I'd add is medical research, clinical trials, life sciences, medical devices. I mean, I don't think we're going to be changing the drug approval regime, but I think around that, this is obviously something after COVID that's been identified as a big area. The UK life sciences is one of the UK's big areas. I think it's another interesting test case of whether we grip the nettle and go for a divergent regime, or whether we just keep on with trying to mirror the EU as closely as possible.
Okay, I'm going to thank all our panel there. That was absolutely fantastic, a really interesting and energizing discussion about possibilities. For those of you that didn't have enough about Scottish independence, rejoining the EU, potential borders, can I recommend our event on Thursday, which is going to be looking at that. For those of you who are interested in how this might play with the new Conservative coalition, we're discussing the Red Wall and some focus groups next week. But to close, can I thank all our fantastic panelists? Can I leave you all now to get to grips with that 100-page white paper, or maybe a page and a half from Sue Gray, whichever is your preference. And thank you all very much for joining us today. And let's virtually applaud a fantastic discussion from our panelists. Thank you all.